The bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party will be supporting this bill as it has in prior stages. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister has ably described, New Zealand is proud to be part of the International Monetary Fund and to contribute to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Speaker, all of these institutions, or indeed these institutions and their forerunners, were an outcome of international cooperation following World War II, after which the world came together and said we need to ensure that we don't make the mistakes that led to World War II and to the rise of fascism and communism, where countries that suffered economic collapse didn't have a way of getting out of the downward spiral that they found themselves in. And so countries of the world decided that that they needed to provide international institutions which could help reconstruct some of the countries that had been so damaged by World War II, and also to provide for support for countries that get into terrible trouble in peacetime. It was one of the outcomes of international cooperation which has served the world very well overall since then, and has seen decreasing numbers of wars, decreasing proportion of the world living in poverty, and the international community being able to come to the aid of economies that are in dire trouble following collapse. And we've seen the IMF over the years bail out countries from as disparate as Asian countries, African countries, European countries, and South American countries, including the likes of Argentina. And were it not for the support that other countries are able to provide through the International Monetary Fund, the troubles that we've seen in those countries would have more likely to have resulted in civil war within those countries and political instability, the rise of more extreme forms of government, including fascism and communism, to the detriment not just of those populations, but to the detriment of world peace and to the detriment of world trade, which we benefit from. So although this piece of legislation is not the most important that will pass through this House this year, it is appropriate to note the importance of these institutions. The Labour Party is a party that believes in an outward-looking interaction with the rest of the world. We think that it's even more important for small countries than for larger countries that we have these multilateral institutions, and it's important that the Labour Party support them. I'm surprised that at the prior reading of this bill, the Green Party were opposing it, and I don't know whether they're continuing to oppose this legislation, but if they are, I think that is unwise. I think that the IMF provides very important supports to the world. It is true that some of the advice function of the IMF has at times been contentious. The IMF has been dominated by an American view of economics, which has lots to offer but is not always perfect. And the IMF advice to emerging nations, and included in that were nations that are moving from controlled economies to open economies, such as we saw during the late 1980s and 1990s in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet bloc. Some of the advice that was given to emerging nations to move quickly to smaller forms of government and to privatise previously publicly owned institutions was extreme and resulted in outcomes in those countries which were less than perfect, and has seen the rise of oligarchs in Russia, in no small part facilitated because of the regime that was recommended by the International Monetary Fund. But that doesn't mean to say that the International Monetary Fund and their advice is fundamentally flawed, and I think overall they're a force for good. So I am disturbed to see that our colleagues in the Greens are voting against this bill, which serves to update the arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. What's that? Oh, sorry. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the legislation itself, the Labor Party is on record as saying that we think these things are sufficiently important that they should attract the attention of Parliament rather than allowing future amendments to the International Monetary Fund articles, which control how it operates, being delegated to statutory regulation, and we have opposed that part of the bill. We've lost that debate. We think this legislation is worse for that. We think that having every decade or so an amendment to the articles through Parliament enables us to reflect on the importance of international linkages and advice from the IMF. It enables parties like the opposition, whoever they may be at the time, currently us, to reflect on parts of the IMF advice which are being ignored. And at the moment, the International Monetary Fund is saying to New Zealand that one of the most important things to improve the New Zealand economy is to have a neutral investment signal into the economy through a capital gains tax. The OEC, beg your pardon? Shane Jones most certainly does believe that. Having a neutral investment signal into the economy is fundamentally important so that people are investing in our economy based on the profitability of a business rather than a tax bias. Too much money is invested in New Zealand in land-related transactions because there is a tax advantage to doing so. The IMF, the OECD, the Treasury in their own way, the Reserve Bank and just about every economist in New Zealand say that we will have a stronger economy through introducing a capital gains tax, which in the case of the new Labor Party proposal would exclude the family home. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting that the government believes in the IMF but rejects that important piece of advice. The Labor Party hopes to remedy that in the future when re-elected, which will act to the benefit of New Zealanders, will result in a fairer tax system, more employment opportunities, a lower current account deficit and growing wealth in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, this is a good piece of legislation. The IMF, as I have said, provides leadership in the world. One of the other areas where they are looking again at what are good settings lies around exchange rate policy. The IMF has moved away from the idea that inflation targeting should be given primacy ahead of other important aspects of economic management like current account deficits and the exchange rate. It's another area where the Labor Party has moved on, but the national government has yet to see the light. I think one day they will, but in the meantime, of course, our non-primary exporters are suffering an exchange rate which would be different if the Reserve Bank had a different mandate. We've heard the Minister, Bill English, saying that nothing would change if there was a different mandate. Well, it's true that if the mandate of the Reserve Bank was different, not everything would change, but it is axiomatic that if the mandate of the Reserve Bank was broader and included a more balanced reference to other important matters of economic management, that their decisions at different times would be different and we would have a different economic outcome, which in the view of the Labor Party would improve the New Zealand economy. It would mean that some of our non-primary export manufacturers could survive, some of those who are, well, Mr. Bennett shakes his head, but the truth is that manufacturing outside of the primary sector is continuing to shrink, including in areas where it has survived for decades. Some of these companies are world-leading and they are increasingly moving their production to countries that have a better exchange rate regime, better monetary policy regime. They are not companies with high labour input. They are selling high-value products. They're the sort of exporters you would think should be able to survive in a country like New Zealand if we have the right economic settings. But they are not investing in New Zealand. They are shedding jobs in New Zealand. And they are increasingly outsourcing their production to other countries. It's not that they're going broke, it's just that they can't make a living in New Zealand, and so they're forced to relocate elsewhere with the loss of jobs and incomes. And as a consequence, too many New Zealanders decide that they can't make a living here and they depart to Australia or elsewhere. Too many of our young people don't have job opportunities here. And we lose the benefit of that economic activity in New Zealand, which we are instead transferring to the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. It provides us with an opportunity to debate matters not relating to the advice function in the IMF, and I think on that front the government is being too selective in the advice that they are taking.
John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I greatly respect the previous